Because I was muted.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the open house tonight. We really do appreciate anyone that takes the time to come out of their busy schedules to be here, so thank you. Before we begin, I would just like to start with the township's land acknowledgement statement. The lands we know today as the Township of Whistling have been home to Indigenous people since time immemorial. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Hattawandrum, as well as the treaty lands and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. With increasing encroachment by non-Indigenous settlers in the Township of Whistling, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee could not continue their traditional lifestyle and settled in their villages along Credit Valley and the Grand River Valley. These Indigenous nations uphold their treaty rights within our jurisdiction. Today, the Township of Whistling remains home to Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to share and respect Mother Earth and are committed to building constructive and cooperative relationships with the Indigenous nations. So this slide will just go over the agenda that we have tonight. So the first is just the impacts of the Bill 23 on the non-designated properties that are on our Heritage Register. We'll then go into a Heritage Designation FAQ, kind of a few things to know about being a designated property owner. We'll then move into Heritage Permit FAQ, as well as the Township's Heritage Grant Program. And then we'll finish off with the designation process and the next steps. So, due to recent legislative changes made by the provincial government, municipal governments across Ontario are reviewing their listed non-designated properties to be considered for designation. The township currently has 108 properties on its Heritage Register, and 15 of those properties have designated status. Additionally, at a recent council meeting in October, council stated its notice of intention to designate on an additional 23 properties. So bearing no objections for those, these properties will have designation bylaws passed, aka those properties will have designated status as of February 2025. As I mentioned previously, this work is all spurred because of Bill 23 and the impacts that has on the Ontario Heritage Act. Any properties that are included on the township's Heritage Register with non-designated status as of January 1st, 2027 will be delisted or off the register unless they become designated. So, and at that time, the property cannot be relisted on the register for a period of 5 years. After that deadline, culturally significant properties with non-designated status will lose interim protection from demolition. So it's very important to engage with property owners throughout this process and ensure that there is an understanding of how the designation process does and does not impact your property. Well, next we'll just move into a few heritage designation frequently asked questions that we often receive. The first, why is heritage designation so important? As a rural community, heritage designation is a very important tool to preserve our community's cultural and architectural heritage and to conserve the identified heritage attributes of the structures. This is very important now, as well as in generations to come, to preserve these structures within our community. And it's also what makes our community unique and an interesting place to live while encouraging tourism within the township. So is my property designated or non-designated? Properties on the township's Heritage Register have different statuses, designated and non-designated. Again, we have 15 designated properties in the township, an additional 23 going through the designation process right now. So if all are approved, there will then be 38 designated properties in the township as of February 2025. The rest of those properties, as of now, have non-designated status. What does that non-designated status mean? Non-designated status means that if there was a property listed on the township's Heritage Register, it has interim protection from demolition and interim protection from certain Planning Act applications. Property owners are required to provide 60 days notice for their intention to demolish or remove a building or structure from their property. Properties with non-designated status do not have any restrictions from building permit applications. And as previously stated, because of the changes to the provincial government in Bill 23, those non-designated properties are going to be removed from the register on January 1st, 2027, and will lose their interim protection. What does it mean to have a designated property on the register? So these properties are designated by our township council through the approval of a heritage designation bylaw. Within each of the bylaw, there are bullet points of each of the property's heritage attributes that are to be protected from demolition or alteration. So when a property owner wants to make any changes to those features, they will need a heritage permit. The next FAQ is questions staff often get around heritage designation, as there are often so many misconceptions related to what heritage designation does or does not mean for your property. Heritage designation does not limit the installation of any modern features or renovations on the inside of your building, and it does not require the property owner to restore any lost architectural elements on the outside. That kind of leads us into myths and facts that we often like to say around heritage designation. A lot of people believe how heritage properties can never be changed. Designation properties can be changed, they just need a heritage permit. So there just is a process in place when wanting to make those changes. Another myth we get is that designated properties are more expensive to maintain. We often like to say that what is expensive is neglect of any building, not necessarily the age or the heritage designation of the building. Heritage conservation really focuses on minimal intervention, and designation does not require any restoration of features that have been modified over time. And lastly, the other myth is that designated properties have more expensive home insurance. According to the province of Ontario's website, insurance premiums should not be increased due to heritage designation of a property. Insurance companies may increase their premium for older buildings, or a building once it reaches a certain age, if it's outdated or has old heating or wiring systems. But designation itself does not place any additional requirements on the insurer and should not affect your insurance premium. So the next FAQ, how are properties designated under the Heritage Act? Number one, they're identified as a candidate for designation. So for this next batch of property owners, council at its September 3rd meeting, 2 months ago now, identified your property as a priority property for designation. The next step, once council identifies your property, it is researched and evaluated for its cultural and heritage significance by the Township's Heritage Advisory Committee. This is the current stage of the designation process for your property. After that, a report is brought to council recommending that council state its notice of intention to designate. Following council stating its notice of intention to designate, property owners will receive a notice or a letter in the mail in accordance with section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And there is a 30-day objection period in which anyone may object to the designation. After that 30-day objection period, council will consider any objections and kind of withdraw that notice of intention to designate or proceed with passing a designation bylaw on your property. Number 4 and number 5, if council does proceed with that designation, a copy of the bylaw and the notice of passing will be sent to you again. You will receive another notice as a property owner. And we also have to send that to the Ontario Heritage Trust. At that point in time, there is another 30-day appeal period. And if no appeals are received, that heritage designation bylaw will come into force and effect following the last day after the appeal period. And then lastly, number 6 and number 7, a copy of that bylaw is then registered on title and sent to the Ontario Heritage Trust. And the property owner now has designated status on our township's heritage register. So what do you need to know as a designated property owner? There are a few responsibilities as a property owner with a designated property. When your ownership changes on a designated property, the new owner must give notice to the clerk of the municipality within 30 days of becoming that owner. Property owners also cannot alter or renovate any of those heritage attributes that are listed in their designation bylaw unless a permit has been issued by township council or staff. Property owners are not allowed to demolish or remove any of the heritage attributes listed for heritage or listed in the designation bylaw unless a permit has been received. And property owners must maintain the identified heritage attributes as listed in the designation bylaw and be in compliance with the township's property standards bylaw. We'll now move into our heritage permit process and questions we often receive for that. So number one, what is a heritage permit? So property owners who own designated properties under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act must apply for a heritage permit when making changes to their property. The permit must be received before making any changes that could impact the heritage attributes. And in order to support the designated property owners, there is no fee for this heritage permit application. You could have an external fee if there's any third-party costs associated with the permit application, but the township does not have a fee for the heritage permit. So when is a heritage permit required? Our township has 3 different types of heritage permits: a heritage permit waiver, an alteration permit, and a demolition permit. The heritage permit waiver is required for any change to a designated property where the property owner believes it will not impact a listed heritage attribute. This is much more of an expedited process, and council has delegated that authority for staff to make that decision and process these applications in a much more timely fashion. The alteration and the demolition permit are required for any change that will affect the property's heritage attributes. So these changes could include replacement, demolition, alterations or repairs of a heritage attribute. So that's if a listed heritage attribute is the brick of your building and you're repainting that brick, you would need a heritage alteration permit. If a listed heritage attribute is your original front door and you're wanting to replace or update that original front door, you would need a heritage alteration permit for that. So what are my property's heritage attributes? Property owners get mailed their designation bylaw following council's approval. And within all designation bylaws there is what is called a statement of cultural heritage value or interest. That statement includes a section with quote unquote description of heritage attributes. And that's just a bullet point list, as you can see here. And those are the attributes that the bylaw protects. When is a heritage permit not required? Any sort of interior renovations, any sort of backyard hardscaping that would not be visible to the general public, landscaping without any heavy machinery, routine maintenance to your property that it will not slow the deterioration or disrepair, thinking like gardening, repainting things with little to no change in color, weatherproofing. To go along with this, staff have created a heritage permit guide that is available on our township website. We also have a few here if you'd like to pick them up, and it goes over everything related to our permitting process. With that being said, we always recommend that you contact staff to determine if a heritage permit application should be applied for. And again, no fee for this process, but should the change need a building permit, the property owner would be responsible for any building permit related fees. Here's just one example of a building in Cambridge. So it was originally built in the between 1884 and 1887. And it was originally a post office that later became a government building. It was designated as a National Heritage Site in 1983, and in 2018 was converted to the Idea Exchange, where the exterior was restored and that new glass pavilion was added. So this is a great example, and it shows the adaptive reuse and the ability to make alterations when you still have a designated property. The last big topic is our Heritage Grant Program. So at a recent council meeting, council directed staff to draft a Heritage Grant Program policy for implementation in 2027. The intention of this program is to assist with any of the costs associated with making any changes. And that would be related to sort of the adaptive reuse of your designated property. And you could also apply for it when making alterations, restorations, or improvements of those heritage attributes listed in your designation bylaw. The grant program was chosen by council due to its flexibility, and it can be tailored to affect the local priorities of West Lynch. The grant funding can be used to, you can apply for the grant funding whether you're doing a project big or small. And this program is scheduled to be implemented in 2027. To ensure there's equitable access once all priority properties are designated. So what is next for this process for your property? So this is the current, this is kind of where we're at for the current process. So again, at that September 3rd council meeting, council identified 27 properties as candidates for designation in 2025. We then circulated site visit letters and drop-in requests for those properties. We attended a few site visits, and then we sent out another notice for the property owner to let them know about this open house tonight. And then currently, your draft statements, which you would have also received in the mail, are being reviewed by our Heritage Advisory Committee, and we are at the open house stage of this process. And finally, what is next for these, for this designation process? The tentative schedule is kind of as you can see here. We are planning to bring our statements of cultural heritage value or interest to the December 2nd Heritage Advisory Committee meeting. At that point in time, the statements are provided to the township's peer reviewer for review. After that, staff will report to council, recommending stating their notice of intention to designate, and that's tentatively scheduled for the spring. You will then receive a notice in the mail as a property owner, which we also have to send to the Ontario Heritage Trust. And in that notice will include the objection period that you have. Staff will then report back to council regarding any of the objections we do receive and recommend designation for any properties for which objections were not received. And that's tentatively scheduled for the summer of next year. And then finally, there is a notice of passing of those designation bylaws, and the property owner is then sent another notice of that as well. We do send it to the Ontario Heritage Trust. And in that notice, there is information on that notice of 30-day appeal period that we talked about. And that is also tentatively scheduled for the summer of 2025. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming. That concludes our presentation. I think our goal for us as staff is to provide property owners with a clear understanding of the designation process and to be a resource for you. So should you have any questions, we've printed off your statements. We can go over any questions sort of one-on-one with the property owners here tonight with any questions that you may have. Thank you.